June 22, 1941. An ordinary summer morning. People are still asleep, someone is going fishing, someone is getting ready for work, children are playing in the yard. Everything seems familiar, calm. No one knows that in a few minutes their lives will change forever. A hum sounds in the sky, at first quiet, as if planes are flying far away. No one pays attention. But then this hum turns into a roar. And suddenly, the first explosion. Then the second. And then dozens, hundreds. The ground trembles. The sky flashes with fire. People run out of their houses, not understanding what is happening. They still don't know that the war has begun. It came suddenly, without a declaration, without warning, without a chance to prepare. Germany attacked the Soviet Union according to the Plan Barbarossa, the largest military operation in the history of humankind. More than 3 million soldiers, thousands of tanks and aircraft. The German army crashed down on the western borders of the USSR like an avalanche. And the Red Army, despite its enormous size, was unprepared. The leadership did not believe in an attack until the very end. Intelligence reported a possible threat, but Stalin believed that Hitler would not dare to launch an open conflict while the war with Britain was ongoing. And so a strict order was in force in the army: do not succumb to provocations. Even if German planes cross the border, do not open fire. And when on the morning of June 22 thousands of German aircraft struck Soviet airfields, everything happened too quickly. Planes were destroyed right on the ground, hundreds of tanks were bombed, communications were cut, the command did not understand what to do. The Germans advanced like a knife through butter. City after city, Minsk, Smolensk, Kiev, fell under the onslaught of the Wehrmacht. The front collapsed, armies were encircled, millions of soldiers were taken prisoner. For those who lived in the west of the country, the war began literally at dawn, with fire and panic. People grabbed their children, documents, bundles of belongings and fled, not knowing where. Trains were overcrowded, stations were burning, thousands of refugees crowded the roads. No one understood what was happening, no one knew where it was safe. This suddenness became one of the main reasons why the USSR suffered colossal losses in the first months. The country simply did not have time to reorganize. There was no time to evacuate factories, strengthen defenses, assemble troops. Everything happened in a matter of days. The Germans were counting on a lightning victory. Hitler said that the Soviet Union would collapse within 3 months, that it was enough to kick in the door and the whole rotten structure would come crashing down. And in June-July 1941 it seemed he was right. The Red Army retreated, cities surrendered, thousands of kilometers of territory fell under enemy control. But the most terrible thing was not only the defeats at the front. The most terrible thing was the people. Ordinary families who had simply been living their lives. For them, the war began without any warning. Yesterday they listened to music, wrote letters, made plans, and today their houses were burning, their loved ones disappeared, their world collapsed. Many were engulfed by a wave of violence, fear, and chaos. No one understood what to do. The only thing that could be saved was life, and not always even that. The Soviet Union lost millions of people in the first months of the war. These were not only soldiers, they were civilians caught in the path of the enemy. Those who did not manage to leave, who remained under occupation, who died under the bombs or in the first battles. The whole country experienced shock. People did not believe it was actually happening. The radio broadcast messages about the attack, but even then not everyone grasped the scale of the tragedy. It seemed like a misunderstanding that would soon end. But it didn't. Each day became harder than the last. This suddenness cost millions of lives. It brought the country to the brink of catastrophe. But it was precisely then, when everything seemed lost, that an awakening began. People realized that if they did not rise and fight, they would simply cease to exist. The entire country, vast and multi-ethnic, was faced with one reality: survive. And from that moment began the story of incredible resistance. But back in June 41, no one was thinking about heroism. Everyone was simply trying to save themselves, their loved ones, their home. And the way the war came so suddenly became the beginning of the darkest chapter in the history of the Soviet Union. When people talk about World War II, they often forget one simple thing: no country in the world fought over such a vast territory as the Soviet Union. From the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea, from Leningrad to the Caucasus, the front stretched for thousands of kilometers. It was not just a sector of fighting, it was an entire country turned into a battlefield. No army in history had waged war over such distances, where the front line could run through forests, swamps, mountains, steppes, cities, and villages. Every meter of this land cost blood. When the Germans invaded in the summer of 1941, they advanced with 3 huge army groups, north, center, and south. Each was aimed at an entire region. And the whole country came under attack simultaneously. In the Baltics, Belarus, Ukraine, in the northwest of Russia, battles raged everywhere. People didn't have time to evacuate, didn't have time to understand that the front was already outside their windows. Imagine, yesterday your town had a market, noise, music, children in the streets. And today, tanks, gunfire, destroyed houses. The front ran not somewhere far away, but right through the lives of ordinary people. The vast territory was both salvation and a curse. On the one hand, it allowed retreat, regrouping, buying time. On the other hand, it was precisely because of its size that the country lost millions of people. The Germans moved swiftly. They captured cities, encircled armies, destroyed everything in their path. Every day the front advanced by dozens of kilometers. And the farther they went, the more people fell under occupation. These were tens of millions of citizens, families, the elderly, children, who had no chance to escape. When a front is stretched across thousands of kilometers, it is impossible to hold it equally strongly everywhere. Somewhere there aren't enough people, somewhere there aren't enough weapons, somewhere there is simply no communication. Hundreds of battles occur simultaneously. In the north, near Leningrad, where people would endure almost 3 years without food. In the center, near Moscow, where the fate of the entire country was being decided. In the south, for the oil of the Caucasus, for the bread of Ukraine. And all of this was one gigantic front where thousands died every day. But a vast territory means not only the front. It means millions of kilometers of rear areas, factories, railways, fields. All of this had to be saved as the enemy approached. A massive evacuation began, entire factories were dismantled and moved east, to Siberia and the Urals. People were taken away together with the equipment. Trains ran without stopping. Women, children, the elderly, everyone traveled deep into the country, into the unknown. Often under bombardment, in the cold and hunger. Many did not make it. But it was precisely these evacuated factories that later became the heart of the war industry. They forged weapons for the front while their native cities lay in ruins. The front cut through everything, through destinies, through families, through cities. One village could be Soviet today, German tomorrow, and Soviet again the day after tomorrow. People didn't know who would come to them tomorrow, their own or the enemy. Everything changed instantly. And the wider the front, the harder it was to control anything. Command could not react quickly enough, communications were constantly lost, and each sector of the war lived its own life. Imagine what it means to defend a country that stretches for thousands of kilometers. It's like trying to hold back a storm with your hands. The further the front stretches, the thinner the line of defense becomes. In one place the enemy is stopped, in another he breaks through. And this constant pendulum cost millions of lives. People were transferred from one end of the country to the other without rest. Tanks and soldiers traveled thousands of kilometers, moving from one battle to the next. For Germany, such a front also became a trial, but for the Soviet Union it was a nightmare stretched over years. Each region, each city, each village paid its price. In the west, burned villages. In the center, destroyed cities. In the south, hunger. In the north, the blockade. Everywhere, death. And all of this was part of one vast battlefield called the motherland. When you look at a map of the war, it seems like just lines, arrows, names of cities. But behind each arrow are thousands of dead. Behind each front line, hundreds of destroyed homes. Behind each movement of an army, human destinies of those who simply happen to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. And it is in this scale, in this endless front, that one of the main reasons lies for why the Soviet Union lost so many people. It was a war where the enemy did not come to the borders, he came right to the doorsteps. Where the front could pass through your village and leave nothing of it. Where it was impossible to hide, because the entire country had turned into a line of battle. When the enemy entered the territory of the Soviet Union, one of the most horrific periods in history began: occupation. Death, hunger, and fear followed the German troops. Wherever the front passed, life disappeared. People who had lived peacefully the day before, worked, raised children, dreamed, suddenly found themselves under the power of those who did not consider them human, but merely Eastern vermin. That's what Germans called the inhabitants of the USSR in their documents. For them, it was not just a war for territory, it was a war of extermination. The occupied lands stretched from the Baltics to the Black Sea. This was millions of square kilometers where the occupiers' laws now applied. Everything served one goal: to destroy, plunder, subjugate. In every town, in every village, a new authority was established. First soldiers came, then the so-called commandant's offices. They decided who would live and who would die. Men were taken for forced labor, women and children, to camps or to factories in Germany. Everything of value was taken away: food, livestock, machinery, furniture, everything. People were left with nothing. But the worst were the executions. The Nazis did not simply wage war, they annihilated. In every large city there were sites of mass shootings. The most famous among them: Babyn Yar near Kiev, Katyn in Belarus, Krasuka, Zmeyevska Baka, the Janoska camp in Lviv. But there were thousands of such places. Civilians, Jews, prisoners of war, children were brought there. They were forced to undress and were shot right at the edge of pits. Then they were buried and the killers moved on. Sometimes they didn't even bury them. The earth would continue to heave for a long time from those who had been buried alive. This was a systematic, organized policy, not an accident, not the cruelty of individual soldiers, but cold calculation. Hitler openly said that nothing should remain in the East. People were superfluous. Cities to be erased. Fields to be seized. It was a war of annihilation. Special units Einsatzgruppen operated on the territory of the USSR. Their task was simple: following the army, eliminate everyone who could be dangerous or simply unnecessary. Jews, Roma, communists, the intelligentsia, partisans, anyone suspicious. They shot entire families. Sometimes entire villages. Thus, for example, in Katyn all the residents were burned, 149 people, including children. Alive. Only because someone from nearby partisans fired at a German patrol. Many villages were completely destroyed. In Belarus alone there were more than 600 such villages. Some lost even their names. People were killed for the slightest suspicion, for a found weapon, for talking about the front. Sometimes simply to intimidate. For those who survived, life under occupation became constant fear. Any knock on the door at night and the heart stopped. People hid in basements, in forests, in pits. They tried to save their children somehow. Many went into the partisan movement, but their families paid the price. The Germans acted simply: if someone from a village went into the forest, then everyone was guilty. They burned houses, shot residents. A special place was occupied by death camps and concentration camps. There were thousands of them on the territory of the USSR alone. Some for prisoners of war, others for civilians. There were no conditions, no food, no water. People died from cold, disease, hunger. It was considered that Soviet prisoners were not people and could be treated like animals. In the Dulag 100 camp near Smolensk, for example, about 100,000 people died in just a few months. The Nazis planned to reduce the population of the USSR by tens of millions. Those who remained were to become slaves, to work in German factories and fields. Everything else to be destroyed. This was not an ordinary war, it was genocide. And amid all this horror there were still those who did not give up. People helped partisans, hid Jews, saved neighbors. Each such act was a feat, because it was punished by immediate death. But thanks to these people, millions managed to survive. When the front retreated, the Nazis left emptiness behind. Burned villages, destroyed cities, thousands of murdered. Soldiers of the Red Army, liberating the territory, often could not believe what they saw. Villages where only chimney stacks remained. Dead children, women, the elderly. No one could understand how it was possible to do such things to people. That is why the war for the USSR was not just a struggle for victory. It was a struggle for life. For the right to exist. For ensuring that such things would never happen again. When we speak about the losses of the Soviet Union, we must remember, millions of these people did not die at the front. They were killed cold-bloodedly, deliberately, methodically. Just because they were Soviet. Leningrad. Autumn 1941. A city of nearly 3 million people was cut off from the rest of the world. The Germans encircled it with a ring. From the north Finnish troops, from the south and west German divisions. All roads were blocked. In essence, Leningrad became a giant trap. And the blockade began, which lasted 872 days, almost 2.5 years of hell. In September, the enemy cut the last railway line, and the city was left without supplies of food, without fuel, without medicine. People did not yet know what awaited them. They thought it would be brief, that help would come, that the army would break the ring. But days passed, and the ring only tightened. The bombings did not stop. Factories, schools, hospitals, everything came under fire. At first, food stocks still remained. People stood in long lines for bread, believing there would be enough. But by the winter of 1941 everything changed. The bread ration began to fall. First 400 grams a day, then 300, then 250 and finally 125 grams per person. 125 grams is a small piece, less than a matchbox. And even this bread was not made of flour, but of a mixture of oil cake, wallpaper dust, and cellulose. It was black, sticky, with a bitter taste, but it was all that people had left. That winter was among the coldest. Frosts reached -40. There was no heating in homes, no electricity, no water. People burned furniture, books, even parquet floors for warmth. They fetched water from holes in the ice on the Neva. The city turned into an icy labyrinth where people moved slowly, like shadows. Bodies lay in the streets. At first they tried to bury them, then there was no strength left. People died right on the road, and no one could help, no one had the strength. The worst thing was hunger. Real, merciless. It killed slowly, turning a person into a shadow. People ate everything: glue, leather belts, wallpaper paste, even sawdust. They boiled leather straps, cats, dogs, rats. There were cases of cannibalism, and archives preserved documents of how the police hunted those who tried to survive at any cost. It sounds monstrous, but in hell morality ceases to exist. People simply wanted to live. But even under these conditions Leningrad did not surrender. Factories continued to work. At the Kirov plant, where tractors had been made, tanks were now assembled right under bombardment. Teenage girls carried shells, women stood at machines for days while shells fell nearby. In schools where the stove could still be lit, lessons continued. People tried to live. It sounds almost unreal, but this was one of the strongest manifestations of the human spirit. And all this time the voice of the radio announcer Olga Bergholz sounded. Her words became a symbol of hope. She said, "No one is forgotten, nothing is forgotten." These phrases were like a vow, a pledge to the entire city, to endure, no matter what. The only connection with the outside world was the so-called road of life across Lake Ladoga. In winter over the ice, in summer, by water. Along this route a little food was delivered to the city, and in the opposite direction children and the wounded were evacuated. Trucks drove over thin ice under constant shelling. Often it did not hold, and vehicles sank along with drivers and passengers. But there was no other way. Thanks to this road, thousands survived. By the spring of 1942, only half of the 3 million residents remained alive. The rest died from hunger, cold, disease, bombardments. Every day thousands died in the city. And yet Leningrad did not surrender. People kept standing. They kept believing. In spring the snow began to melt, and bodies appeared from under the drifts. The city looked like a cemetery. But instead of surrendering, people began to clean it. Streets were restored, trams were launched again. The city lived, despite everything. It was in blockaded Leningrad that a strength was born which would later be remembered as a symbol of unbending spirit. No one thought about glory or heroism. Everyone simply wanted to survive and not let the enemy pass. Every minute lived was a victory. Each day that the city did not surrender struck a blow at the enemy's plans. When the blockade was finally broken in January 1943 and fully lifted in January 1944, the city lay in ruins. Fewer than 1 million of the 3 million residents remained. But Leningrad survived. And it was a miracle, not divine, but human. Today, watching the newsreels of those years, those gaunt faces, those hands frozen stiff from cold, those eyes that hold no tears because there are none left to shed, you understand this was not just suffering. It was strength. It was a faith in life that did not die even when everything around it died. 872 days of darkness, cold, fear, and pain. And yet the city did not surrender. Because in it burned something that no bomb could extinguish: human dignity. The scorched earth tactic became one of the harshest yet forced methods of warfare used by the Soviet Union during the Great Patriotic War. Its essence was that, during retreat, all material resources that could be used by the enemy were destroyed: stocks of food and fuel, industrial equipment, infrastructure, railways, bridges, power plants, and even residential buildings. The goal of this strategy was to prevent the enemy, advancing into the country, from using captured territories for supply and fortification. After Germany attacked the USSR on June 22, 1941, the situation at the front was catastrophic. Soviet troops were forced to retreat under the pressure of superior enemy forces. The army lost communications, depots, equipment, resources. German troops moved at incredible speed, up to 4,050 kilometers per day, capturing new territories. In these conditions, the Soviet leadership faced a choice: either leave the enemy industry, food, and infrastructure, or destroy them to deny Germany the ability to consolidate. The second option was chosen. The scorched earth tactic was officially endorsed by the Supreme High Command's order of July 3, 1941. In his address to the nation, Joseph Stalin stated directly, "In the event of a forced retreat, do not leave the enemy a single kilogram of bread or a liter of fuel." This order was implemented on a scale unprecedented in history. As the Red Army retreated, entire towns and villages were destroyed by their own forces. At enterprises, equipment that could be evacuated to the rear was dismantled, everything else was blown up or burned. In rural areas, crops, livestock, and grain reserves were destroyed so that German troops could not use them for supply. The tactic saw especially wide use in the summer and autumn of 1941 during the retreat from Belarus, Ukraine, and the western regions of Russia. Smolensk is an example where, during the evacuation of factories and depots, everything that could not be removed was destroyed. Similar measures were applied when leaving Kiev, Minsk, Oryol, and other major settlements. As a result, the advance of the German army was accompanied by the devastation of the seized territories. It must be noted that this strategy had a dual effect. Militarily, it did complicate the supply of German forces. The German army, counting on using trophies and resources of the occupied regions, faced shortages of food, fuel, and fodder. This slowed the pace of the offensive and worsened morale. Combined with the massive evacuation of Soviet industry to the east, it allowed the USSR to preserve economic potential and continue producing weapons. However, the humanitarian consequences were catastrophic. Civilians left behind were deprived of the means of subsistence. Hundreds of thousands of villages and settlements were destroyed. People lost their homes, harvests, property. Often they simply had no way to evacuate. In some cases, residents, left without food and shelter, died from hunger and cold. Thus, the scorched earth tactic dealt a severe blow not only to the enemy but also to the Soviet population itself. Particularly tragic were the cases when settlements on the front line were destroyed. Thus, during the 1941 retreats, entire villages were burned so as not to leave the enemy shelter. Militarily justified, these actions caused immense suffering among civilians. After the war, many of these areas were recognized as zones of mass destruction. It should also be noted that similar measures were used by the Germans during their retreat in 1943-1944. After the defeats at Stalingrad and Kursk, German troops began to use the same tactic, destroying cities, bridges, and infrastructure to slow the Red Army's advance. As a result, by the end of the war, much of the European part of the USSR lay in ruins. The scorched earth tactic became a symbol of the country's ultimate exertion. It was a step of desperation, but also a step of determination not to allow the enemy the use of a single resource. It demonstrated the readiness of the people and the army to endure any sacrifice for the sake of victory, even if it meant destroying their own land. In the end, despite the enormous losses and suffering of the population, this strategy played an important role in slowing the German advance, bought the USSR time to regroup, and allowed it to preserve key industrial centers in the east. Historians assess it as one of the most controversial yet necessary measures in the struggle for the state's survival. The Great Patriotic War entered history as one of the bloodiest and hardest. No front, no battle in the world compares with what the soldiers and officers of the Red Army had to endure. It was a war in which the fate not only of a country but of all humanity was at stake. And on the path to victory, each of these battles became a test of the ultimate human limits. From the very first months it became clear, this was not an ordinary war. It was a struggle to the death. Fighting took place for every meter of ground, for every village, for every house. Losses were measured not in hundreds, but in thousands of people per day. Sometimes, tens of thousands. In a single sector, more people could die than in an entire campaign of any other war. The battles for Moscow, Stalingrad, and Kursk were especially brutal, three engagements that became symbols of courage and resilience. In the autumn of 1941, German troops approached Moscow. The enemy could already see the domes of the capital through binoculars. Everything depended on a few weeks. Temperatures dropped to -30, soldiers froze, equipment would not start. But despite this, Soviet fighters stood to the death. Every house, every village became a fortress. Not only soldiers fought for Moscow, workers, students, militia. Even teenagers went to the front lines. When in December 1941 the Red Army launched its counteroffensive, the world saw for the first time that Germany could be stopped. This victory was the first turning point of the war and a symbol of faith in one's own strength. But the most terrible battle of the entire war was Stalingrad. It lasted more than 200 days, from July 1942 to February 1943. The city on the banks of the Volga turned into ruins where fierce fighting raged for each floor, each building. The streets were piled with bodies, the air reeked of smoke and dust. The Germans called Stalingrad hell on earth. Soviet soldiers held on until their last bullet, their last breath. When in November 1942 the encirclement of Field Marshal Paulus' Sixth Army began, the course of the war changed. For the first time the powerful German army was completely destroyed. This marked the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. A few months after Stalingrad came the Battle of Kursk, the largest tank battle in human history. In the summer of 1943, along a front over 600 kilometers long, 1.5 million soldiers, about 6,000 tanks, and 4,000 aircraft clashed. It was a true steel storm. On the field near Prokhorovka, two avalanches of armor, Soviet and German, collided. The earth shook, the air burned with gunfire, smoke covered the sky. In this inferno, Soviet troops withstood the onslaught and then went over to the counteroffensive. After the Kursk salient, the initiative finally passed to the Red Army. But heavy fighting took place not only on the most famous axes. In every sector, in every operation, in every village there were heroes, feats, and tragedies. Sevastopol, Leningrad, Rzhev, Oryol, Novgorod, Minsk, each of these cities was paid for at a tremendous price. In some, not a single building remained intact. In others, half the population perished. Soviet soldiers often fought under conditions unimaginable today. Without communications, without support, without food and sleep. Sometimes with one rifle for two, sometimes without cartridges, but with a vow to stand to the end. In frost, in mud, under continuous artillery fire, they held the lines. And when one fell, another took his place. Thus was forged the legend of Russian endurance, later acknowledged even by the enemy. The moral strain of these battles cannot be conveyed by numbers. Soldiers saw death every day but kept moving forward. They buried comrades right in the trenches, sometimes not even knowing their names. They knew only one thing: if they retreated, the motherland would perish. And therefore no one had the right to surrender. The fights on Soviet soil were not just clashes of armies, they were a confrontation of worlds. Hitler's Germany bore an ideology of annihilation, and the Soviet Union defended people's very right to live. Therefore, every meter of land was soaked not only with blood but with meaning. It was a struggle for existence. By the end of the war, there were hardly any families untouched by loss. Every home, every street kept the memory of those who did not return. But it was in these most arduous battles that victory was born. It did not come quickly, it was suffered. Today, looking at photographs of those years, you see faces tired, emaciated, but unbroken. People who went through hell and yet remained human. They did not think of glory. They simply did what had to be done. And it is thanks to them, to their endurance, patience, and boundless faith in victory, that the Soviet Union held out. These unbelievably hard battles became the foundation of our memory. They proved that even in the face of death a person is capable of the impossible if he is defending his land. When people talk about the war, they usually recall the front, battles, tanks, heroism. But there is another front, invisible, without weapons and without shots. This is the rear, a place where people fought not the enemy but hunger, cold, and exhaustion. And although it is mentioned less often, it was there that the fate of the country was being decided. After the war began, a huge part of industry and population was evacuated eastward to Siberia, the Urals, the Volga region, Kazakhstan. Hundreds of factories were transported by entire trains. Giant machine tools, equipment, people, animals, everything traveled for weeks, under bombardment, in freight cars. Sometimes trains stood stranded in the steppe because tracks were destroyed. People lived right on the platforms, ate, slept, froze. When the trains finally arrived, the factories had to be reassembled from scratch on bare ground, without electricity, without housing, under the open sky. Yet in a couple of months they began producing weapons, tanks, shells. It was a labor feat often paid for with health and life. Everyone worked: men, women, children, the elderly. The workday lasted 1,216 hours, sometimes without days off, without food and sleep. People fainted at the machines, but got up and continued to work. In some cities, women replaced entire male teams. Girls of 14-15 operated lathes, the elderly stood at blast furnaces. They had no choice, everything they produced went to the front. And everyone understood, if the factory stops, people at the front will die. But work in the rear was not the only trial. The main enemy was hunger. Everything produced was sent to the army. Food was rationed by cards. Workers' rations were slightly higher than others, but still catastrophically insufficient. People ate whatever they could get: boiled potato peels, gathered wild greens, made soups from flour and water. Many families survived only by growing something near barracks or on abandoned plots. The winter of 194,243 was especially harsh. Stocks ran out, transport barely worked, and hunger reached even the rear regions. In the Volga region, the Urals, Siberia, people often died right at their workplaces. Cases of starvation became widespread. Rations for adult workers barely exceeded 400,500 calories per day, a survival level. Disease compounded everything. Due to poor nutrition and unsanitary conditions, typhus, dysentery, tuberculosis spread rapidly. Hospitals lacked medicines, dressings, doctors. Even iodine and bandages were often replaced by improvised means. Nurses and orderlies worked around the clock without rest, saving ever more wounded. People lived in extremely harsh conditions. After evacuation, many found themselves in barracks, warehouses, basements. There was no heating, there was a shortage of firewood. In winter, the temperature inside buildings dropped to zero. People slept in their clothes, covered with rags. In families where the men were at the front, everything fell on the shoulders of women. They worked, stood in lines, cared for children, buried relatives who died of hunger, and in the morning went back to the factory. Children were not spared either. Many were orphaned, their parents were killed at the front or died on the road. Orphanages were created in the cities, but even their food and warmth were lacking. The little ones died of exhaustion, and those who survived helped adults, carried coal and water, worked in factories, sorted scrap metal. The rear became a mirror of the front, only instead of bullets and bombs, hunger killed there. And yet people did not give up. They understood that their work and privations were a contribution to victory. Posters hung in the shops, everything for the front. Everything for victory, and these were not just words. Every person knew that soldiers' lives depended on them. While Europe lived under occupation, deep in the Soviet Union millions fought in their own way, with empty hands but an unbending will. They gave their last crumbs, shared bread, helped neighbors. Even in the hungriest regions a sense of unity remained, no one had the right to break. By the end of the war the rear was as exhausted as the front. People were emaciated and ill, but continued to work until Victory Day itself. Thanks to their efforts, the country not only held out but went on the offensive. Without these nameless heroes who died not from bullets but from hunger and cold, there would have been no victory. Today we often remember the frontline soldiers, and that is fair. But we must also remember those who fought without weapons, who battled at the machines, in the fields, in hospitals, in freezing barracks. Their struggle was also a feat. Quiet, nameless, but no less great. The Great Patriotic War tested not only weapons and courage but also human will. In total war, when the very existence of the state was at stake, the Soviet leadership established a system of military discipline based on strict control, fear, and unconditional obedience to orders. This discipline saved the front but cost the country the lives of tens of thousands of its own soldiers. From the very beginning, the Soviet army was in an extremely difficult situation. Losses were colossal, thousands of units were encircled, communications with command were lost. In these conditions, cases of panic, desertion, and unauthorized retreat began. To stop the collapse of the front, in July 1941 Order No. 270 was issued, signed by Joseph Stalin and People's Commissar of Defense Semyon Timoshenko. This document became a symbol of harsh military discipline. According to the order, any commander or political officer who surrendered was declared a traitor to the motherland. Their families were subject to arrest. Soldiers who threw away their weapons or left their positions were considered deserters and subject to execution on the spot. Units were forbidden to retreat without a written order from higher command. Thus, fear of one's own commander sometimes became stronger than fear of the enemy. Even harsher measures were adopted in the summer of 1942 when the situation at the front again became critical. After a series of retreats and the loss of Kharkiv, the famous Order No. 227 was issued, known by the slogan "Not a step back." This document marked a turning point in the Army's disciplinary policy. The order stated, "Panic mongers and cowards are to be destroyed on the spot. Do not retreat under any circumstances." To enforce the order, blocking detachments were created, special NKVD units positioned behind the front line. Their task was to prevent soldiers from fleeing the front line. In cases of retreat without orders, they had the right to open fire on their own. By various estimates, more than 400,000 people passed through such units during the war. In addition, a system of penal battalions and companies was introduced. Officers and soldiers who violated orders, showed cowardice, or disobeyed were sent there. The term of service in a penal unit was usually 1 to 3 months or until the first wound. In practice, this meant an almost certain death. Penal soldiers were used in the most dangerous sectors, breaching operations, reconnaissance, demoning. Despite the horrific conditions, many of them redeemed their guilt with blood and returned to regular units, becoming rare but heroic examples. The disciplinary system built by Stalin and the general staff had a dual nature. On the one hand, it restored order and control in the army, prevented mass flight, and preserved the front. On the other, it was accompanied by enormous and often unjustified human losses. Cases where innocent soldiers were accused of cowardice or treason were not rare. Sometimes units were wiped out entirely because they were unable to fulfill impossible orders. There was also the practice of field courts-martial that considered cases on the spot without lengthy proceedings. Decisions were made instantly: guilty, execution. Sentences were often carried out the same day. According to statistics, in 1941-1942 alone, more than 1 million servicemen were convicted under articles dealing with desertion and cowardice, with several tens of thousands executed. Nevertheless, strict discipline cannot be viewed solely as an expression of cruelty. In a war for survival, it indeed played its role. It forced the army to stand its ground even when everything seemed lost. Enemies noted that Soviet units continued to resist where other armies would have laid down their arms. Fear of punishment, multiplied by a sense of duty and patriotism, created that unbending resilience that became one of the reasons for future victory. Harsh discipline existed not only at the front but also in the rear. Workers, engineers, collective farmers, all were subject to wartime regulations. Being late or skipping work could land one in prison. Loss of equipment, court-martial. People lived under constant control but understood this was part of the common front. In the post-war years, attitudes toward this system remained contradictory. For some it was a symbol of tyranny, for others a necessary measure without which the country could have perished. Today historians agree on one thing: despite its brutality, it kept the army from disintegration at critical moments. The harsh discipline of the Great Patriotic War is one of the darkest yet integral pages of history. It shows the price of order when the existence of an entire people is at stake. It was a war with no gray areas, only duty, fear, and the necessity to endure at any cost. By 1944, the Great Patriotic War had been going on for almost 3 years. During this time the country went through everything: defeats, hunger, blood, fear, and hope. People were exhausted. The army was exhausted, the rear was exhausted, the land itself, scarred by millions of shells, was exhausted. The war had become not just a struggle for victory, it had become a test of the limits of human endurance. Each day resembled the previous one. Mornings began with the sound of artillery, evenings with silence in which only the breathing of survivors could be heard. People lived from offensive to offensive, from order to order. Everything obeyed a single rhythm: the front. At first many thought victory was a matter of months. But the longer the war dragged on, the clearer it became: this was not a temporary disaster, it was a new reality. War entered life so deeply that people forgot what peacetime was like. Children born in 1941 were already going to school by 1945, and their childhoods had passed under the sounds of sirens and explosions. Soldiers who had marched hundreds of kilometers did not believe in rest. For them the war became a way of being. They slept in trenches, ate from mess tins, lost friends, and the next day pushed forward again. War erased everything human, turning people into shadows driven only by instinct and duty. Many felt it would never end. Exhaustion was felt everywhere. In the army, a constant lack of sleep, food, ammunition. In the rear, a lack of strength, fatigue from endless work. People lived on the edge. Women and the elderly who had replaced men at the machines barely stood on their feet but still worked. Not because they wanted to, but because they had to. Even victory stopped bringing joy. After each liberated city, ruins, dead streets, charred walls. People rejoiced and cried at the same time. Each step forward cost thousands of lives. The Soviet army marched toward Berlin, but every meter of the path was drenched in blood. By 1944 most soldiers no longer dreamed of glory. They simply dreamed of surviving. To see home, their loved ones, to smell bread, to hear silence without explosions. This war made the simplest things, ones no one had thought about before, into happiness. Exhaustion became the common state of the nation. Even good news was received without emotion, just as a respite. People were tired of fear, tired of suffering, tired of hoping. But this very fatigue, paradoxically, became their strength. When there is nothing left to lose, one can only go to the end. In the spring of 1945, the war truly approached its end. But for those who lived through those long years, victory was not perceived as a holiday. It was relief, but not joy. Millions did not live to see the day. Millions returned maimed, orphaned, having lost everything. The Great Patriotic War became the longest and most agonizing page in the history of the USSR. It lasted almost 4 years, but left an imprint for decades. After it, no one was the same. People learned to value life truly simply because they had lived too long among death. Spring 1945. After 4 years of suffering, pain, and loss, silence finally descends over Europe. On May 9, words that millions had been waiting for echoed on the radio: the war is over, victory. For some it was a cry of joy, for others, quiet tears. People did not shout from happiness, they simply kept silent, not believing it had truly ended. The country that had survived the greatest catastrophe in its history had endured. From Brest to Vladivostok, from Sevastopol to Murmansk, in every city, in every home there was not so much a feeling of joy as of relief. No more bombings. No more death notices. No more fear. Only silence. But that silence was paid for at a terrible price. More than 27 million dead soldiers, officers, civilians. Millions of orphans, widows, and people crippled in body and soul. From hundreds of villages only names remained, from thousands of cities ruins. There was not a single family untouched by the war. Victory was won not by weapons, but by perseverance, labor, pain, and faith. It was forged not only at the front, but also in the rear, at the machines, in the fields, in hospitals. It was the victory of not just an army but of an entire people, where everyone, from child to elder, made their contribution. Every meter of liberated land cost human lives. On May 9 there were no grand parades and fireworks as today. People simply embraced. Soldiers sat on the streets of Berlin, stared into the distance, and kept silent. They did not feel joy, only fatigue and grief for those who did not live to see it. Victory was bright yet bitter at the same time. The Soviet Union emerged from the war a hero, but also wounded. The country lay in ruins. Everything had to be started from scratch, restoring factories, cities, villages, families. Those who returned from the front took up work again, because they knew, if they had survived the war, they could do this too. Since then, May 9th has become a sacred day. Not just a holiday, but a day of remembrance. Remembrance of those who died, who did not return, who remained forever in the soil of foreign and native fields. Each year veterans put on their medals, and in their eyes there is not pride but pain. They remember how much the country paid for that day. The price of victory is not only destroyed cities and millions of victims. It is the years stolen from an entire generation. It is childhood spent in orphanages. It is mothers who never saw their sons again. It is men who never lived to old age. And yet victory became a symbol of unbreakability. It showed that even in the darkest times a person can stand firm. That love of life is stronger than fear, and faith in the future can overcome even death. The war ended, but its trace remained forever, in songs, in books, in films, in memory. And as long as this memory lives, victory lives. Because victory is not only the end of war. Victory is the life that was returned at the cost of millions of other lives.